Pero buenos días. Bueno, yo creo que podemos empezar la clase, son y 35. Ya he pasado los 5 minutos de rigor. Veo que están los de siempre, o sea que si queréis empezamos con el tema. Vamos a ver hoy el tema 57, el tema 59 y el tema 27. Son tres, son tres temas de los cuales el más bonito yo creo que es el 57. Y luego el que más me gusta a mí es el 59, que es un poco la historia política de los Estados Unidos. Un poco todo lo que hay desde 1945 de presidentes hasta la actualidad y tocando algo de la época literaria, ¿no? Entonces, el que vamos a ver hoy, más o menos guarda un poco la misma relación, se puede hacer así como una comparativa entre el 57 y 59 porque es prácticamente lo mismo. Vamos a ver un poco la evolución histórica, vamos a basarnos un poco en los autores más determinantes de esta época, veremos un poco, pues un poco lo que vimos también el otro día cuando hablamos del modernismo, tocamos un poquito a T.S. Eliot con el modernismo y luego pues un poco su influencia sobre los diferentes autores que vienen a continuación, como pueden ser D.H. Lawrence o Virginia Woolf. Foster es así como más intelectual. Yo lo puedo, vamos, a mí me suena más que Foster se puede asociar un poco más con una forma de ver, de entender la literatura, pues más estética. Se me ha ido el nombre de este autor tan famoso de... joder, que escribe... no es Thackeray. Bueno, ya me vendrá. Es un autor que nace en Estados Unidos y vive toda su vida en Inglaterra. ¿Lo conocéis? Joder, ¿cómo se llama? Vaya. Bueno, Henry James. Thank you. Henry James. Henry James. Un poco del mismo estilo como Henry James, ¿vale? Entonces, el autor, bueno, pues más o menos, yo creo que se puede parecer un poco a este autor por el hecho de esta forma de entender un poco, pues, la literatura, la forma de lo intelectual, el camino estético que sigue. Bueno, si bien es cierto que Henry James proclamaba el cosmopolitanismo, Foster en sus libros va a tratar un poco más lo que es la cultura del viaje, bueno, un poco la relación entre Inglaterra, bueno, el Reino Unido y las former colonies. Entonces, bueno, más o menos vamos a ver un poco eso. Y luego, pues en el tema que veremos 59, pues lo veremos en su momento. O sea que vamos a pasar, si queréis, directamente ya al tema 57. Le explicamos y luego si tenéis alguna duda, pues comentamos, ¿vale? Vamos a ver. Un momento que cierro todo esto. Vale. Bueno, pues Theme 57, the United Kingdom in the interwar period and during the Second World War. Representative authors. Este tipo de temas es muy interesante el hecho de ver los representative authors, porque aquí no hay nadie que diga que tienen que ser unos autores u otros. O sea que aquí podemos nosotros poner los autores que nos den un poco la gana. Si bien es cierto que, bueno, hay ciertos autores que no hay que dejar pasar, como es el caso, yo voy a tratar lo más general y el tema desde un punto de vista muy genérico. Si había algún autor que os haya gustado de este siglo, podéis incluirlo y además podéis decir que como cuestión personal os gusta este autor por esto y por esto. Entonces esto es siempre muy interesante de comentarlo, ¿vale? Si hay uno que así lo personalizáis, desde luego. So, what are we going to look at today? Well, today we're going to be looking at first the history of the UK between 1901 to 1952. That is, the end of Victorian period, Victorianism. It ends with the death of Queen Victoria in 1901, and it would give way to the next period, which would be the Edwardian Society. His son Edward, who would reign for 12 years, and after Edward would be followed by Henry the Sixth, which is the current father of the Elizabeth II, who died recently, and so or the great grandfather of King Charles today. 52 is the year of is when George VI dies and starts this new reign by Queen Elizabeth II, and so with the end of George VI, with the death of George VI, we would have the end of an entire society and the end of the so-called British Empire philosophy or ideas. Because with Queen Elizabeth II, there's a new perspective, a new scope that is going to be given to the UK, kind of modernizing both the institution and England, and it's the beginning of the end of the so-called British Empire. From the 1950s onward, Britain is going to see their position in the world very, very weakened. Even the political prestige is going to be downsized because of these sort of crises that it would emerge into after the empire and the expansion of the empire. A crisis that would not would or England would emerge from these crises with the Margaret Thatcher years, and with Margaret Thatcher, in a way, they would recover their importance and their economic prestige and economic resources, and so they would become one of the leading countries in Europe. Until nowadays, with the Brexit decision and the fact that they have abandoned the European Union, and so all the advantages that were supposed to be or that were associated with the European Union. And so again, it starts a sort of a period where England is trying to search for their own identity. So that would be the introduction. Then we would look at T.S. Eliot. Who's this man and why he's so important in the English literature? He's really important because of he's got several poems which plays a lot with the symbolism and the modernist theory. Really, T.S. Eliot is an author for intellectuals. T.S. Eliot is not conceived to be read by common people. There's a lot of symbolism. If you're not well educated, if you're not high educated, in the means that you haven't gone to university and you haven't touched any idea or anything related to the philosophy and the anthropology, then very difficult to understand. D.H. Lawrence who is going to focus more on the clash between classes, although he's not going to refer to anything related to the to the communism. He's going to focus on the difficulties that people had coming from different backgrounds, social backgrounds. In fact, he experienced that difficulty himself because both of his parents they were from different social backgrounds. Then we have Virginia Woolf, who is a feminine writer and also kind of modernist. He's probably Virginia Woolf is so important because first the focus she has on women's on the women role, and second because he shows a sort of a worry about the passing of time. Most of his works are going to deal with this passing of time. Ian Foster, as we said, more or less like this Henry James idea of cosmopolitanism, traveling, etc. And then the older generation, which is probably the last of this period. There's nothing much to say about the older generation. They were not even a generation by themselves. They were called the older generation because they were just a bunch of writers that belonged to the same generation, talked about more or less the same topics, and so the only way of grouping them was around one of them, the most charismatic poet of the time, which was W.H. Auden. So let's have a look at the beginning about the history. Well, first of all, we have the end of
of Victorian period with 1901, and the start of a new king, a new society, a new century, starting with 1901 and ending in 1910. During the Edward VII reign, we've got two things are important. First of all, the suffragist against the suffragist. Women start to move themselves and to start to demand their own rights. There are two ways of demanding these rights. One was more violent, which are the the suffragettes, and the other ones were more pacifist, more political. Now, Emmeline Pankhurst was a woman whom, a feminist woman who found in violence the only way of capturing the attention of England's of British society. He gathered many different women around herself and around her idea that violence was the only way of vindicating themselves. And so there were two women. One of the women in the suffragists. Well, there were different moments or different events which implied quite a lot of violence. One of them burned himself, and another one threw herself to some horses and carriages going through. And so they were kind of rejected by society because the Victorian period did not want it. The so-called Victorian period did not want this sort of women who were seen most of the time as the devil women because they were independent. They had their own ideas. They did not respect, in a way, the masculine world of the Victorian period. The masculine world referring to the that politics was only reserved, to people, to men. And so, and on the other half, we've got Millicent Fawcett, who was also a feminist and vindicated the role of women, but she tried to vindicate it, and she only thought that the best way to vindicate her role was through politics and making these political speeches and trying to convince the politicians around her to incorporate to the women world or to the women's different rights in society. And so, in a way, the two signs of or the two parties, or the two feminine parties of this time, they actually achieve achieve these rights because at the end society British society would recognize women the capacity or the right to vote. By 1904, we've got the Entente Cordiale, which refers to the treaties of peace and trade signed by Britain with the other countries, with France and also with Germany. Now, this Entente Cordiale was very important because it allowed the European Union to spread themselves and to spread the political liaisons through Africa and through the Eastern world. During this Entente Cordiale, England occupied Egypt, which afterwards would see in 1956 that General Nasser would try to incorporate back Egypt and to vindicate the Egypt nationality by attacking the British and nationalizing the Suez Canal and going against Anthony Eden, against Anthony Eden, who was the Prime Minister at the time. Morocco was for France. So more or less we see here that it's the start of the spread of this colonial period, or the end of the spreading of the colonial period, the culmination of this colonial period. Well, during George VI's reign, which would last from 1910 to 1936, we'll have first the Parliament Act, which in 1911, where the Houses of Lords lose the right to veto any economic legislation, and this was sort of a very social reform because the Houses of Lords have rejected several times a law that was sort of outlined and defended in the parliament, in the Houses of Parliament, in the Houses of Commons, and the Houses of Lords were kept by, blocking this idea of or this economic legislation. So the King George VI saw that it was his position, and the English society was, above all, the working class was starting to become rather tired with these Houses of Lords. And so what he did was that he decided that the Houses of Lords could not have any veto on anything regarding economic legislation. So this was a great change, and give quite a lot of power to the Houses of Commons. And this is still today very interesting, because the House of Lords cannot veto anything related to taxes or economic matters. So kind of very liberal ideas that were applying during this first half of the 20th century. Now, during this period, also we have the confrontation against with Ireland. Ireland had passed 3 Home Rules Acts, and the last one was already decisive, and it gave back the Parliament to the Irish. Now, the Irish were not happy with this idea with the Home Rule, because it wasn't really applied. The First World War had outbreaked, and the Home Rule Act was not effectively done. So by 1916, there is the Easter Rising, which was a rebellion against the British rule in Ireland, and kind of set the basis for the afterwards war against Britain, the British-Irish War in 1921. Now, by 1914 to 1918, we have the First World War, where almost, and I put that it was a romantic war, and this is something true, because people in England and all over Europe, they went to fight this war as a sort of a romantic idea of fighting for the country. The politicians and the country itself sold this war as something of a patriotic act, and of a romantic idea that you were fighting for your own country, that your country was your motherland. And so this was certainly sold all over the country, kind of deceiving these youngsters that they went to war thinking that, well, this was just another war which would not have any consequence at all. And in fact, it is one of the most deadliest wars whatsoever. Around 1 million people died in the war. And many others became wounded and with a lot of mental suffrage. In fact, Virginia Woolf, in his book The Mrs. Dalloway, is going to make reference to this problem of the mental health produced by the wars. There's one of the characters who's in a wheelchair who finally kills himself. So by 1919, with the Treaty of Versailles, the war was ended. Germany was seen as the country where the blame was to put on, and in fact, this Treaty of Versailles, which was imposed by the British and the French, is in a way the excuse that the Germans, that the Nazi Germany is going to attack the beginning of its rise, because they see this Treaty of Versailles as punitive and unfair. And in fact, Adolf Hitler is going to criticize this Treaty of Versailles, where Germany was to be blamed for everything, and the British and the French did not take any blame. And so, in a way, we see that the rise of the Nazis also is because of this. It's rooted in this Treaty of Versailles, where Britain and France take advantage of Germany. Well, 1919 to 1921 is the Anglo-Irish War. We know that Ireland had passed many many difficulties. The first one with the 1801, the Irish Parliament was shut down. 1840 with the Great Potato Famine, in which around 1 million people were 1 million people died, and another million had to migrate. And then the Home Rule Acts, the successive Home Rule Acts, the first ones, the two first ones that were denied, and the William Gladstone period. William Gladstone, who was the Prime Minister of the UK at that time. And if you have, y si habéis ido a Londres, tiene una estatua Gladstone cerca de la USL, de la University College of London. Tiene ahí una estatua, el tío está sentado. That's William Gladstone. Calvo, con grandes patillas, cara de mala leche. That's William Gladstone. 1912, they accepted, but it was not put into force because of the outbreak of the World War One. Well, in 1936 is the abdication of Edward VIII, because of his desire to marry Mary Simpson. Wally Simpson. Wally Simpson was a divorced woman, an American divorced woman. The British society did not see this marriage as correct, and so they were kind of rejecting the idea that Edward VIII was to be the King of England, and so he abdicated in George VI, which is the father of nowadays Queen Elizabeth II. Well, nowadays not the great grandfather of King Charles. Well, George VI would reign from 1936 to 1932. He is going to lead the country during the Second World War. Important, the appeasement policy that was carried through the years by Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister. Now, Neville Chamberlain, he recognized that the Treaty of Versailles was punitive and unfair, and as a matter of fact, he decided to carry a sort of an appeasement policy, trying to agree on the terms that Germany asked, so giving back certain territories to Germany, etc. But the Nazis were not happy with that idea, and so the appeasement policy was not respected. In fact, the Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1940s. One of the treaties that that Britain had signed with Poland was that in case Poland was invaded, they would come into the rescue. So by 1940s, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and so the British stand against the Nazis by themselves. And now this is something important because nobody understands, and that's something that's why the British are so. They cherish so much the Second World War and everything related to the Second World War, because they believe themselves as to be the saviors of Europe. And truly, if you think, if you read the story, the British stand alone against the Nazi Germany. The French did not attack the Germans. In fact, they were invaded. The Americans, they did not start the war until they were bombarded in Pearl Harbor around 1942. So the ones who really contained the Nazis almost for a year alone were the British. The British were the ones who fought against the Nazi Germany, and the ones who I think they haven't seen themselves being recognized for this. The Europeans, they do not. They all think that Germany was really bad, and etc. But they do not recognize the role of Britain during the Second World War, and that is something by which I believe the Britons always have this idea towards Europe as being, hey, we have saved yourselves, and you haven't been thankful for this. You should recognize something to us. now and give us a special status or something like that. And that's something the Europeans do not want to accept. Well, there's two battles very important. The Battle of Britain, which in Britain, well, the Nazi Germans rallied against Britain, bombarding London and the most important cities. Then the Battle by the Alamein, where the General Montgomery won and defeat the Fox of the Desert, Rommel, who was a Nazi leader, and who in fact it was kind of a Nazi leader, but no, he did not agree on the terms of Adolf Hitler's ideas of being a Nazi. He was more of a military man, and in fact he would be recognized as a military man. In fact, after the Battle of Alamein, he would kill himself. 1944 is the Normandy landing in cooperation with the American troops, and 1945 would be the end of the Second World War. Now, by 1947, India asked for the independence together with other countries like Burma, Pakistan, etc. And in 1947, under Clement Attlee's administration, would start the end of the reign of in Britain colonial system, or Britain dominance over the world. So let's now begin with the literature regarding T.S. Eliot. Well, T.S. Eliot is the father of, or at least is one of the great representatives of the modernist. Now, the modernist has to do with or how the self or the individual is related to the industrial, or to the industrial period, to industrialism. We know that we have this Victorian period who criticizes the rise of the industrial period, and criticizes the role of industry and how it affects the self and the people, denouncing how the people live in the countries. But modernists, they want to also explore this new relationship that appears. Now, there are 5 features related to modernism that I like to point out. First, the individualism. Usually, the modernists are believed to be as the new romantics, or the neo romantics. They want to vindicate the self. They want to vindicate the personality of one against the whole society. They also, as they want something new and experience something new, they're going to base themselves on the experimentation, and they're trying to do experiments on poetry, on how they write, on the writings, etc. Not most of the times, but the absurdity is also another feature in which they base their writings. A lot of symbolism and formalism. Symbolism, trying to write for only educated people, and the themes that are going to be dealt with are themes that are very related to the times they have to live. First, the confusion; second, the isolation; and third, the disappointment with life. And if you regard the context of writing, we have now from 1901 to 1945, there is a period of complete disappointment, isolation, and confusion. There's a lot of wars, many deaths, many people die, youngsters die at war, families become broken. So, kind of a very obscure period in that sense. Now, there's also as a rejection of the modern value, of the traditional values. These modernists, they want something new, and so they're going to question first the marriage, then the religion, and also the relationship between men and women, and the gender roles. So, sorry. What about T.S. Eliot? Well, T.S. Eliot won the Nobel Prize in 1948. He kind of the biggest, or the most famous of his poems is Wasteland, where he receives influences from Wagner, the musician, also from Shakespeare, also the Bible. So there's kind of a lot of influence of different writings into his own writing. Now, what T.S. Eliot writes about is loss and how this loss affects the people. Now, there's also allusions to the Second World War and how society is influenced by these by the period of the First World War, in the sense that they have been influenced on the mind. So psychologically, society has also been influenced. They have realized that there's no romanticism, and finally, he turns or he reflects about the emotional collapse, something that Virginia Woolf is also going to deal with. So, T.S. Eliot was an American, but in 1927 he became a British citizen. He converted to Anglicanism, which would have a great effect on his works. Now, the features of his work is first, he, as a modernist, he wants to experiment with language and seek or at least revolve around themes such as language, time, or history. The First World War has a great impact on on himself, both morally and religiously. He seems to be standing against religion, and so he or have or writing with the free verbs allows him to reject the tradition, reject society, and kind of free himself. So, among the poems he wrote, we've got the love song of Alfred Prufrock, which basically what he tries to create is new rhythms with the different accents of the words, and trying to use contemporary language. The Wasteland, which is the most important, where he starts with a sort of conce- well, sort of images in which are or broken images or images of broken or um, but yeah, a heap of broken images. Then he also finishes his poem with with following these rhythm of the London Bridge is falling down. So trying to incorporate that same rhythm or that same intonation into the song. So again, this idea of experimentation. And in his poem in Wasteland, there's a sort of a celebration of the death of the death of the culture due to the First World War. First World War seems to be as the end of the world, or at least for T.S. Eliot, the end of culture. And it seems that the world has gone mad and has forgotten about its cultural roots with the World War One. Then we have the four quartets, which is 4 poems highlighting the spiritual renewal and the connection between the present and the past, something that Virginia Woolf is going to do too. And and there's also a sort of, although he rejects religion, there's quite a lot of influence from religion himself. So this would be from T.S. Eliot. Now let's have a look at D.H. Lawrence. Well, who's this author? D.H. Lawrence is a writer whose both parents belong to different classes. His mother belongs to more of a middle class family, whereas his father belongs to the working class. His father is an alcoholic, is a miner, and his mother tries to focuses on the education of D.H. Lawrence. So there's quite a clash between both of them, and sort of this clash, this difference between the working class and the middle class, Lawrence really observes and acquaintance of this big difference that exists between the two of them. And Lawrence is going to write most of the times about the problematic existing between the working class, and also and the problematic of the sex. He's going to focus a lot in the sex relationship and the gender relationships. Now he would settle down in Italy. In fact, D.H. Lawrence is going to be classified as a pornographer. He's going to be criticized by the sort of novels he wrote. And so he flees to Italy, and then he would die in the south of France. Now, what about his work? Well, his work was during the time he wrote was kind of seen as a pornography and very criticized, not intellectual at all. But afterwards, after the Second World War, the works of Lawrence are going to be incorporated in a way, in a sense that they're going to vindicate this idea of individualism that is vindicated throughout his novels. Now, he's very much influenced by his years in Nottinghamshire, and the themes that he's going to explore are female sexuality and the psychology. Now, he's considered as one of the greatest modernist writers, together with Joyce and Virginia Woolf, who both of them are going to deal with this same idea regarding and focusing on gender roles and the sex roles. Now, what about the works of D.H. Lawrence? Well, the most recognized novel is Lady Chatterley's Lover, now very much in vogue because of Netflix film. But it's kind of one of his most representative novels because of this love that he pictures between a man who belongs to the working class and a woman who belongs to higher class. So it's a kind of a not love relationship, but rather more a sexual relation, existing a kind of a sexual tension between these women coming from the high class and the man from the lower class. Now, it's also a sort of a commentary on the marriage and the marriage relationships, and it's one of the books where the F word is commonly used. Now, what about Sons and Lovers? Sons and Lovers is probably one of his best novels. It's very much autobiographical, and it depicts its influence in Lawrence's early lives, where he pictures a father who's an alcoholic, and he seems to portray through the figure of Paul Moret, who's the character, who's the protagonist of the novel, his necessity of transcending in life. And well, there's a sort of a psychoanalytic analysis of himself and of his family. Now, it seems to be that Paul Morel is inspired in his own self. Now, the Rainbow focuses on the Brown family and this homoerotic episode between Ursula and a female teacher. Also condemned and very criticized for the sexual content that the book had, and it was banned from society because of these obscenity images. Woman in Love refers again to the relationship between, again, everything has to do with the relation between, puts in question what is marriage and the question of marriage, and focuses on two modern women. Women are given a sort of are empowered in the sense that they are pictured as free from any stereotypes coming from the Victorian period. Remember, of this devil woman or this angel in the house woman. And the goal of the novel really is to claim that sex and sexual relations are also a very important aspect in a marriage. Well, the next one is Virginia Woolf. He was born in 1882 and died in 1941 when she killed herself. He belongs to a family of free-thinking parents, of almost of a family of artists. Her first novel, was the Voyage Out in 1915, and she's kind of she's considered as a feminist because of these of the prime role that she gives to her characters. She suffered from many from depression all of her life. Although she belonged to the Bloomsbury group, which so it was a sort of intellectual group who lived in London in a very nice and new neighborhood. I can't remember the name now. Joder, está por la universidad también, la universidad, la USL, University College of London. No me acuerdo el barrio. And well, in this Bloomsbury group, well, it was a group of intellectuals. Also, they dealt with many different matters like sexuality, existentialism, and economics. Now, what are the features of his writing? Well, first of all, there's no introduction at all. She goes right to the point. Then the sort of the path of aesthetics, considering art as a way of considering novel as another tool to get to the aesthetics of the novel. The interior monologue, which uses a lot of the stream of consciousness, this is seen a lot with Mrs. Dalloway, and the introduction of the women's perspective and the women's feelings, which is something that was not done until here. What are the works of Virginia Woolf? First, Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway is a very important, probably the most recognized novel of her own of her novels. There's a sort of well, it focuses first on the thoughts of Clarissa Dalloway, who's the protagonist, and Clarissa Dalloway is throwing a party, and the book is about how she's going to prepare this party and the preparations of that party. And during that preparation of that party, there's a lot of things going on. A lot from a young age that comes back to the country, comes back to the city, and sees herself with him. The keys that she gives to a woman, the relationship with his own husband. Sort of there is also this idea of being restrained and not letting her feelings out. Also, there's this picturing of this gentleman with the British Empire and the wars in the figure of the lieutenant that it has become mad because of the war, and there's this sense of passing of time and the sense of fear of death. There's also a sort of it kind of the novel suggests of this attraction towards another woman that Clarissa feels. The next one is to the Lighthouse. The Lighthouse is three visions of the Ramsay family. It focuses on the feminine world versus the masculine world at work. And well, it's the context is this family living in a summer house in Scotland. By the way, Virginia Woolf, she passed most of her holidays in Scotland too, and though the things that she touches refers again to the marriage, the memory, the passing of time. So and focusing on the transience of life and work. So and the lighthouse is sort of the symbol of one's desires in life that more or less shapes the path that one have to take to achieve those objectives. But at the end, you never kind of attain them. You cannot attain them. You cannot reach. So kind of a disappointment in life. And finally, a room of one's own also talks about the gender, the veto to women from education, and the wondering of why this is happening. Feminist criticism also incorporated feminine criticism to society in which women have to be equally to men. Also analyzes the relationship between the classes, the poverty, the class of classes, and also focuses on the role of women in literature having the same or having the same recognition as men. Well, the last one is Ian Foster. Ian Foster, kind of he belongs to this Edwardian society, a Victorian society, kind of influenced by these 19th century ideas. He vindicates the importance of the Mediterranean civilization as a counterpart of the Northern European countries. He writes as a sort of reminiscence of Victorianism. That's why kind of we can say that we may have or we may make a comparison with Henry James. And among these, the novels, we've got The Longest Journey, A Passage to India, Rome with a View, and Howard's End. Among the most two recognized novels, we've got The Longest Journey, in which it focuses on a Cambridge University teacher who is aspiring to be a writer. Now, the man is called Richie Elliott, who also falls for Agnes Pembroke, and who falls for her and begins a sort of an idealization of love and then an idealization of marriage, which leads him to the abandonment of his friends and everything around him. He soon recognizes that he has a half brother, and his wife Agnes Pembroke tries to plot against his half brother in order to also win their own only their so to be the only inheritors of Ritchie family. At the end, Richie Elliott, he actually becomes a writer. Well, usually it's a novel which point of focuses on a life of conformity and disappointments, really. Then we have a passage to India, which recounts the relationship between Adela Quested and Dr. Hassis. It's kind of focusing on the relationship that exists between the colonial Britain and the colonial India. India is no longer does no longer depend on Britain, and in fact, this is something suggested in the book, that the British and Indians could not be friends until India was liberated from the British power. Now, the passage to India kind of focuses on two classes: the classes of civilization, the UK from one side, and India and the Muslim India from on the other side. The classes of ignorance also on the figure of Adela Quasi, who accuses Dr. Hassis of raping of an attack of raping her, although at the end the writer the audience acknowledges that there's no rape at all. And then we have A Room with a View, which focuses on a criticism on the Edwardian England, and Howard's End, also referring to the question of marriage. Now, all of these, the marriage was something very very present on the on this society, because marriage was, for some of them, was the key to an easy life, or at least a calm life. Finally, we've got the Olden Generation, which is a group of writers that are grouped together by media. We've got W.H. Auden, Lois MacNeice, Cecil Day Lewis, or Christopher Isherwood. And this generation is sort of a journalistic myth. It's something that journalists have invented, so to group a bunch of different writers who are the same age, who also are educated at Oxford, and also share the same political ideas. Really, the most recognizable of all is Auden, whose poetry focuses really on the political and social and psychological context of the period. He's very much influenced by the ideas of Marx and Freud, and well, he's seen as an anti-romantic, as an anti-modernist writer. He wants to write in a clear and analytical way, so that everyone can understand him. And well, his poems are sort of concise, concrete images and colloquial languages, so that they are quick and they can be read. And then he focused on the sense of urgency, and the sense of urgency that society has, and that at that time, and so seems to use that urgency in his own poems. What about his works? Most of the time, the two most recognizables are Spain and The Age of Anxiety. The Age of Anxiety is probably his most recognizable and his successful poem, in which he focuses on the moral and political issues of the society of the time that he lives. Now, this is the end of today's theme. Now, the theme is particularly suitable for a second course of Bachillerato, because in this course we can deal through this theme we can deal with many different ideas. The idea of marriage, the idea of the genders, the idea of the role of women, and kind of compare how society was during the 1945 and society nowadays. In fact, there's very little difference from those periods. Almost 60 years old, almost the age of their parents. So it's good to or grandparents. So it's a good idea to focus on these ideas and to analyze how has been the evolution of society through these authors. And that is the end of today's theme. Any question? Vale. Un tema interesante, bonito, por otra parte. Entonces, nada, merece la pena defenderle. Bueno, pues entonces ahora vamos a ir al siguiente, ¿vale? Que sería el tema, voy a pasar al tema 59, ¿vale? Y el último, que es el de gramática, que es la pasiva, que es el más sencillito, dejamos para el final y así ya, nada, tranquilamente. Vale. Bueno, se ve bien, ¿no? Tema 59. Political, social and economic evolution of the US since 1945, its significance in international politics, current literary panorama in the United States. Este tema es larguísimo, larguísimo. O sea, es un tema que, bueno, si os gusta la política y un poco habéis leído sobre ciertos autores, pues puede ser buena idea. Aquí hay autores que merece la pena mencionar, por ejemplo, To Kill a Mockingbird, de Harper Lee, que es un clásico de la literatura americana. The Blue Sky, que también es otro clásico de la literatura americana. También podemos hablar de In Cold Blood, de Truman Capote. También un clásico que hace del estilo periodístico una novela, basándose en un hecho real. También podríamos hablar de... se me ocurre... así. D.H. Salinger, The Catcher in the Rye, ¿vale? Un poco esta evolución de cómo es un teenager y de la relación, bueno, del descubrimiento del teenager, de sí mismo, ¿no? Y, bueno, pues un poco en este sentido hablar de estos temas. Lo primero que hay que hacer es hablar de la política. Entonces, claro, efectivamente, la política tiene mucha miga porque después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, realmente los Estados Unidos son los líderes mundiales que todavía hoy en día siguen siendo parte o siguen teniendo esa influencia en el resto del mundo. Entonces, sería interesante ir presidente por presidente, hacerse una lista de presidentes de Estados Unidos, que tampoco es muy difícil. Empecemos por Truman, que es el de Truman, Eisenhower. Después de Eisenhower vendría Kennedy, Kennedy Johnson. Después de Johnson sería Nixon, Nixon Ford. Después de Ford Ronald Reagan, Reagan Bush. Bush vendría luego Clinton, Bush hijo, Obama y finalmente, Obama, este otro el rubio, Trump y finally Joe Biden. Entonces, realmente, bueno, son varios nombres que hay que tener en cuenta, pero que realmente son nombres importantes. Entonces, y sobre todo que todo el mundo conoce más o menos. Entonces, sí que merece la pena pues hacerse una lista, ¿no?, de cada uno de ellos. Yo he concebido este tema, pues así, como por presidentes, como si fueran reyes. Y en cada presidente hay una serie de datos que es importante tener en cuenta. ¿Vale? Pues, so let's begin with Harry S. Truman. Now, what is the important thing of Harry S. Truman? The first thing is the creation of NATO. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949. It's something that is based on the so-called League of Nations of Woodrow Wilson in 1921. Remember, Woodrow Wilson was a president of the US during the first half of the 19th century, and he proposed a sort of a League of Nations as to avoid wars such as the First World War. His idea did not convince the European countries, but after the Second World War, the NATO was founded in precisely to avoid these sort of confrontations. Then Truman is responsible for the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was a plan applied to Europe, in which it was based basically on the construction, on the lending money to the European countries that were devastated by the Second World War, and so allowed them to recover from that moment. And so by this financial aids, the US could also spread their influence over Europe, because it was very worried about the expansion of the USSR. So during this period, they would start the policy of the containment policy. Now, when we talk about the containment policy, refers to the trying to contain the spread of communism throughout the world, and that's why they would start to have certain wars that in our mind would be a bit of illogical wars, but really they have a logic, and the logic that it has is to stop the spread of communism. Korean War was one of them, so to stop the influence of Mao's China throughout the Asian continent, and also the USSR through the Asian continent. During Truman policies, he also tries to help to reincorporate men into the civil life, and so there was kind of a lot of aims to make these former soldiers back to their social life. And the start of the Marxism ideas. McCarthy was sort of a judge in the US who started to accuse people of being communist. Now, very important that during this period, the US wanted to fight the communists outside and inside, and the way they had to fight the communists inside was to accusing people of being communist. Most of the people were poets, writers, and people of the spectacle of the cinema. Dwight Eisenhower was a former chief commander of the U.S. troops, was the one who designed the arrival of Normandy in the D-Day, And so one of his most important legislation or actions was the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which ended the segregation de jure. So until that moment, o sea, esto hace 60 años, es impresionante. 1954, America, the US, was divided into Afro-American society and white Anglo-Saxon Protestant on the other side. So there was this segregation de jure, that means by law. And so the 1945 and the 1954 the decision of the Supreme Court was to eradicate the difference between the Afro-Americans and the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. By 1990, also at the same time, starts the Vietnam tension. So Eisenhower sent the first troops to Vietnam to stop the spread of Ho Chi Minh's troops or spread of communism. Rosa Parks in 1955 starts the civil rights movement and this civil rights movement for the Afro-American people. Rosa Parks was a black Afro-American citizen who denied a seat to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and so from that moment onwards, she started a campaign for the civil rights movement, who was also supported by Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And so during Dwight Eisenhower, the NASA, the National Aeronautics Space Administration, was initiated. Now, then we entered the 1960s. That is one of the most interesting periods in the human history, because the 1960s was a kind of the wars was ended. The U.S. was a young society. They also choose and opt for a young president who was Mr. Kennedy. And under Kennedy's ideas was to it seemed that society, the U.S. society was kind of leaving aside the Second World War. They were becoming a very powerful country and a very young and pushy society, and so there was a kind of very optimist ideas within society. However, during Kennedy's administration, there is one of the most controversial moments of the human life, because it was the crisis, the Cuban crisis missile, where the USSR had deployed certain missiles, nuclear missiles, in Cuba, and the US asked the USSR to retrieve them. And so there was a clash between the USA and the USSR. The URSS. Sorry. And so this is by 1960s, Kennedy's administration tried to overthrow Castro's regime, Castro's communist regime, which at the beginning Castro was not kind of a communist, and did not wanted to become a communist. He wanted to have a sort of a different kind of regime, but at the end he turned to the communists because he didn't have any money, and so he needed to be backed by the Russians, by the Soviets. Kennedy was murdered in 1963, and followed by Lyndon B. Johnson, who was the responsible for the two greatest plans that still today have a great importance, which is the Great Society plan, which implied the Medicaid and the Medicaid. The Medicaid was a sort of medical coverage, universal coverage for the U.S. citizens, and the Medicare was a sort of public funds for people who retire at the age of 65. Now, this Great Society project, which was very liberal for the moment, was downsized because of the war in Vietnam, and again, the war in Vietnam. Lyndon B. Johnson continued with this war. It started by Dwight Eisenhower, continued by Kennedy, and he had to continue it because they followed the same idea of containment, of the policy of communist containment. And Vietnam was sort of an important place or an important strategic place. And if you look at the map, it is in fact a very strategic place in the Asian territory. The problem was that there was a lot of dead soldiers, and Lyndon B. Johnson did not ask for a second term because of these publicity he had on the Vietnam War. By 1969, the first man landed on the moon, and by 1968 is the assassination of Martin Luther King, who delivered the speech "I Have a Dream" during Kennedy's administration. 1960s, we end with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon started a sort of his administration focused on the diplomacy. He tried to ease relationship with China through the ping pong diplomacy. He went to China. He was received by Mao. He had a very good relationship with Mao, and so he wanted to strengthen links with China, and so to get this really good relationship with China before the relationship with the Soviet Union, who they did not have. China and the Soviet Union did not have the best relationship among themselves. He decided to end the Vietnam War, and by 1972 we have the Watergate scandal. Now, the Watergate scandal was that Richard Nixon was recording the conversation he had on his own private office, but also he wanted to know the conversations of the opposition, and he was discovered by these two journalists, Carl Benson and John Woodard. If you want, esta tarde, si queréis, podéis veros esta película de Robert Redford y Dustin Hoffman. Está bien, es una película sobre el Watergate scandal. No merece la pena. 1973, we talk about the Arab oil embargo, in which meant that the oil countries decided not to export oil, so the prices of fuel just they skyrocketed, and almost the barrel of petrol went from $3 to almost $12. During this time, the Yom Kippur War outbreak. The Yom Kippur War was Israel decided to spread its continent, and which was to spread their country. Egypt and Syria did not want the Jews to spread themselves, and so they went against war. However, Israel won because they had better armors. Richard Nixon was then banned from power, and was banned by an impeachment following the Watergate scandal. And Gerald Ford was the president elected by Richard Nixon to occupy his power. The most recognizable thing that Gerald Ford did was he pardoned Richard Nixon on this Watergate scandal. También hay una película, Nixon vs. Frost, que habla sobre este escándalo. Y está también muy bien. I recommend you to watch it. Today at night. Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is a Republican. Is a Democrat. He signed the Camp David Agreement, so to end the war against Israel and Egypt. They had very bad relationships. And during Jimmy Carter's administration, we find the Iran hostage family. The Iran hostage family was that the Shah from Persia was overthrown by the Ayatollah Khomeini's followers. The Ayatollah Khomeini did not want the new kind of Iran that was being built by the Shah of Persia, very much Western ideas. And so he wanted to maintain the country according to the Muslim and the Muslim most conservative ideas. And so because of the great corruption that happened during the Shah of Persia's administration, and the great violence that also existed during the Shah of Persia, the repression that existed, there were many people that went against the Shah from Persia. He was overthrown by Ayatollah Khomeini's followers, and so the Iran Revolution ended by 1979. And during this revolution, they assaulted the U.S. embassy, taking as hostages for almost a year the workers in the en the embassy. Hay otra película también de Ben Affleck, también muy interesante, que podéis también ver. Right, what about Ronald Reagan? Ronald Reagan is the famous counterpart or companion of Margaret Thatcher. He's the one who decided to go through this wave of privatization and to downsize the role of the state in the US economy. He is famous for having said the speech of "Let's make America again." So there's a sort of a turn to conservatism, and he's much famous for the fall of Berlin Wall and his relationship with Gorbachev's. In 1981, the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapsing, and so Gorbachev decided to sign a treaty to tear the Berlin Wall. He also had a very good relation with Margaret Thatcher in the sense that they turned to conservatism and to privatization. During his administration, his administration almost it tries to how do you say well, he tries to crush the Soviet Union through different policies, and one of the policies that he implements is the Star Wars doctrine, in which he desires to implement a lot or give a lot of money to the army, so to develop these this strategic defense initiative, which was nicknamed as the Star Wars doctrine. This strategic defense initiative meant that the US has a sort of a shield of rockets that, in case it's attacked by the Soviet Union with a nuclear bomb, they would release all these rockets to the Soviet Union. Kind of the end of the world. Now, the 1990s and the 2000s would have three different presidents: George Bush father, Bill Clinton, and George Bush son. George Bush father, under himself, was the reunification of Germany. He suffers also the war on Kuwait and Saddam Hussein's troops, who decided to go against the Americans in Iraq. Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait's territory. The Americans decided to back the Kuwaitis against Saddam Hussein's regime. Then Bill Clinton would run for presidency 2 times. Bill Clinton was a president coming from a very low income families. He had a very good relation with the Afro-American society, and however, during his legislation, he had quite a lot of problems of corruption, and he was also impeached because of these corruption cases. The most famous case was the Monica Lewinsky case, in which he was thought to have a sort of a sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky, who was his own personal secretary, and he was seen as very bad from the U.S. administration because he was married to Hillary Clinton. George W. Bush becomes president in 2001. The most significant policy of his administration is the war against terrorism. Under his administration, he suffers the attack on the Twin Towers, and he would on the 11th September, and so from that moment onwards, he decided to initiate a war against Iraq and Afghanistan. Also, during his administration, he leaves the start of the subprime crisis, starting in 2007 with the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy. 2020-2021, we find the Barack Obama on one side, uh, Republican, no, Democrat. One of the controversies of Barack Obama, which Donald Trump wanted to, he focused during his election, during the elections, was that Barack Obama was not born in America. You know that to be an American president, you need to be born in America, and so he was thought to be to have born in Africa, but he's not. He had descendants from Africa, from Kenya, but he was born in Honolulu in Haiti. Now, Barack Obama wanted to focus more on the internal affairs of the U.S. He tried to implement one of his star program, which was the Obamacare, improving the quality and the access to healthcare insurance, but he failed. He also promised to end up with Guantanamo jails, and he also failed. However, he was successful on the killing of Saddam Hussein's and Bin Laden, and also Gaddafi, which the three sort of dictators of the Asian territories. And one of the things that he was also praised for is the normalization with Cuba, and the normalization of the relationship between both countries. Donald Trump, when he accessed the power, he wanted to end the illegal immigration, the illegal Mexican immigration. He was the one who said it was good. It was important to build a sort of a wall between Mexico and the U.S. He sort of had a Russian support in 2017 elections, and also he decided, because of these economic necessities, he decided to freeze the relationship with Europe. He decided that Europe had to give more money to the subsidies of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and also sort of a populist criticizing against the press, and he had really bad relations with the press. There is also the problem of the racial tensions with the killing of George Floyd in 2020, and finally he lost the elections in 2021. But the 8th of January of the same year, 2021, there's this assault to Congress, something that is seen as he being the one who suggested these groups to assault the parliament. Now, what about Joe Biden? Well, Joe Biden had to deal with the COVID-19. He recognized that COVID-19 has almost produced 400,000 deaths. He has the task of reunifying the country, which is at the moment very divided into Republicans and liberals because of Donald Trump. He has also created a sort of a national commission to avoid cases like George Floyd, an Afro-American that was killed by the police, trying to relaunch the economy by aiding the small businesses. There's also this return to the climate change policies, which is something that Donald Trump retreated himself. And in matters of immigration, he has provided different policies to reunificate families with separate families, or and also repeal the Trump's veto on entering Muslim countries on the national in NATO. Right. So from 1945 onwards, what is the most recognizable poets or literary movements? Well, first of all, the confessional poets. Confessional poets were a group of poets who focuses on the problems of mind and the mental problems. Their writings are about the physical and psychological traumas. One of the most vindicative is Sylvia Plath and Sexton or Robert Lowell. These three authors speak about the problems of the human mind. Sylvia Plath, in fact, she would kill him herself. Now we have the Beat Generation. They call the Beat Generation because they felt beaten by society. They're sort of the hippies of this generation. They are outcast and they seek to experiment and through drugs. They try to liberate themselves both mind and sexually and body, and so kind of accepting all sort of sexual attitudes. They are the representatives of the hippies and the Woodstock concert, which included around or attended around 500,000 people, quite a lot. And so the most representative authors of this Beat Generation is Jack Kerouac. His best poem is On the Road. Or Allen Ginsberg, who was gay and also in his poems really narrated about his own condition. Or William Burroughs, who was a recognized junkie and who in fact drugged himself in order to write, and he recognized such thing. What about the writers? Well, we have different writers. Among the most famous writers, we have Truman Capote in Cold Blood, who uses their journalistic style in order to write the novels. Then Toni Morrison, the blue style, regarding this rape of an Afro-American girl. Harper Lee, Tequila Mockingbird, focuses on Atticus Finch, the lawyer who defends an Afro-American, and G.T. Salinger, who writes The Catcher in the Rye, focusing on the teenagehood and the start of the teenagers of realizing their role in society and their role and also the roles of sexuality in their own lives, and so it's sort of a rebellion against adulthood. About the playwrights, the most important is Arthur Miller, a communist writer who would also criticize the American dream and the American society. Also, great criticism towards the capitalism. He would write two great plays. The Death of a Salesman, which is a great criticism to capitalism in the face of Willy Loman. Willy Loman is the protagonist. He's the one who's a salesman, and he's very worried about sailing, and he realizes that both of his sons does not recognize his own work as a salesman. And The Crucible is inspired on the witch Salem trial that happened during the Puritan period in the 16th century in America, and is a sort of a criticism to the marketism policy. Also, Tennessee Williams, the greatest of his plays is The Streetcar Named Desire, which focuses on the main figure of Blanche, who is a woman who's married to a Polish man, and it explores the relationship between Blanche and his husband on sexual tensions, restraints, prejudices, and also the mental breakdown of Blanche. David Mamet wrote the Glengarry Glen Rose, which focuses on two protagonists. Roma, who is this successful and almost mannered and savage salesman who is very successful and who is a very violent attitude towards selling. And then we have this gently man who is almost at his 50s and who's very much in worry because he's not selling. Who's Shelley? Shelley, who calls himself as the machine because he used to be a very good seller and not anymore. And so Glengarry Glen Rose is a sort of a play where it's an office full of salesmen who have to sell, and the person who sells the most sell tierras. They have to sell properties, and the one who sells more is giving a Cadillac. Shelley is giving very bad lands with very bad, very really not sellable lands, and so he complains about that he's been given this sort of lands. He's not very much into, not very sellable, and so he's worried about not being able to sell these lands, and so to lose eventually his job. So, finally, the conclusion of this theme is that the US is a superpower of the 21st century. This theme is very interesting to be looked to be analyzed with the students through the different works we've seen. Above all, the cultural context. There's a lot of political, social context that should be analyzed in order to understand today's society. And it's a great insight in the psychology and the culture of America. Okay, any questions? This is bibliography. Anyone like to look at it? El 6 de enero, vale. Pues lo apunto, porque eso lo tengo que modificar. Un momento, lo modifico. Sí, y me gustaría, es que no me he acordado, de poner aquí el grupo. ¿Cómo se llamaba el grupo? Es que era tiene un nombre. No sé si os acordáis del nombre de... Joder, tiene un nombre que fue meterle. No me acuerdo, es que ahora no me acuerdo cómo se llamaba el tipo. Estoy buscándole, pero no me acuerdo cómo se llamaba. Sí, bueno, creo que sí. Sí, QAnon, eso es, QAnon, efectivamente. Lo voy a poner aquí porque esto sí que es importante. Es una especie como de secta, ¿vale? Vale, esto va con mayúsculas. Sí, eso es. Ojo ahí, ¿vale? 6 de enero, efectivamente, QAnon, ¿vale? Que luego además aparece en una foto con un casco con flor, de un casco con cuernos, etcétera, que es ¿cómo se llama este tío? Que es el líder de la secta. Además es una secta. ¿Cómo se llama este? Sí, eso es, que es anti todos los anticomunismo, antisocialismo, antiimperialismo y, y son un poco los que apoyan a Donald Trump. Y el tío se llama eh, eso es, Jacob Chansley. Jacob Chansley. Jacob Chansley. Jacob Chansley. Voy a poner aquí en el chat. Jacob Chansley. QAnon. ¿Vale? Bueno, pues es un poco un grupo conservador, vamos, tipo secta conservadora que apoya en las medidas de Trump. Vale, ¿alguna pregunta sobre este tema? Muy bien.
Para este tema hay varias pelis que podéis veros durante las vacaciones. Pues es primero Richard versus Nixon versus Frost, la película esta de Kevin Costner, creo que es el 13º día o el tercer día o algo así, que es sobre el problema de los misiles. También está eh, la guerra de Vietnam, que es Apocalypse Now. También podéis ver eh, eh, Milk, creo que se llama, que es de Sean Penn, que es de un deportista homosexual. También podéis ver eh, bueno, esta de Ben Affleck, de la crisis de Irán, ¿vale? De que, bueno, hay varias películas. Bueno, visto, no hay preguntas, pues vamos a pasar a la pasiva. Ya vamos a pasar un poco al rollo, a la gramática. Vale, esto fuera. Vale. Pues dejadme un momento, dadme 5 minutos para beber agua y retomamos, ¿vale? Un momentito. Voy a apagar aquí el micro. Vale, ya estoy aquí. Bueno, pues entonces vamos a ver el último empujón del día. Antes de vacaciones, bueno, antes del examen del próximo día. Que, por cierto, os voy a abrir, antes de que se me olvide, y antes de que empiece Fernando, ya que estamos cerca de os voy a abrir, como en diciembre, arriba del todo, pues, una nueva pestaña, ¿vale? Nada más entrar en la página web para que podáis poner ahí, colgar los exámenes, ¿vale? Recordad, por favor, que es que si no es un rollo luego. Subirlo todo a PDF, porque es que me facilita mucho la vida, si no es horroroso. Además luego os podéis bajar el PDF con las correcciones hechas en Moodle. O sea que por favor, subirlo en PDF, ¿vale? Muy sencillo, además, hay tutoriales con OneDrive, podéis hacer fotos al documento y os lo pasa a PDF. O hay un conversor que también lo hace. O sea, I Love PDF también. O sea, hay varias formas de subirlo todo a PDF, ¿vale? Hacer una foto y pasarlo a PDF. Bueno, pues último tema de la mañana de hoy, tiene que ver con el tema 27, la pasiva. Bueno, pues la pasiva realmente es un tema, en fin, esto es, quien quiera arriesgarse a hacer este tipo de temas, pues fenomenal. También está bien, porque bueno, los temas de gramática tienen un punto negro de que puede ser que te digan que no está bien explicado y que no lo entiendan, o puede también que lo expliques tan bien que digan, joder, que bien lo ha explicado, qué buen profesor es. O sea que puede tener este doble rasero dependiendo de cómo interpretéis el tema, ¿no? Entonces vamos a echar un vistazo a qué es lo que vamos a ver en el tema de hoy. Primero, ¿qué es the difference between the passive and the active? Why do we use the passive instead of the active, and where do we use it? The preferences, the context where we use the passive voice. How to make the passive? So first, the usual way of making the passive, then the passive with the gets, and other ways of expressing passive without making a passive, or the problems we have or we find making the passive.
And then finally, the other way around, which is changing the passive voice to active voice. So let's start with the first one, which deals with the difference between the passive and the active voice. What is active voice? What is passive voice? Voice refers to how the subject connects with the verb through an action. So we have the active voice, which refers that the subject or the doer is being said or is being identified, and so it puts the emphasis on the subject. So when we use the active voice, where we put the emphasis of the sentence is rather on the doer, that is on the subject, rather on what is being done, on the verb. Then we have the passive voice. The passive refers to that the focus is put on the center, on the verb, that is on the action. So we put the importance of the sentence on what is being done. Really, with the passive voice, the importance or the emphasis is given to the action itself rather than the doer. In fact, the doer does not allow, is not interesting in the sentence. So it's relegated in less prominent place. In the passive voice, usually as the verb or as the action is given the most important thing, so the complement and the direct object is then fronted, so that the direct object is fronted, and sometimes depending on which subject we use, the subject is omitted. Usually, if it's a pronoun, it's kind of omitted because we would be extracted. The subject would be extracted from the context. For example, the carrot cake was cooked by my mother. Usually, if I'm saying or am I eating in my house, we would tend to omit the subject because we already know that my mum usually does these carrot cakes. So it's already giving context, and we already understand who is the doer. And this sort of voice, the passive voice, is most appropriate for scientific or academic papers. And the reason is because with the passive voice, we reduce the use of the I, and so there's less subjectivity, a more and kind of more objective kind of tendency to writing. Now, the uses of passive. When and why do we use the passive voice? We use the passive voice first when we don't know who has done the action, when we really don't know. And so in those cases, we know what has happened, but we don't know who has done it. For example, the photographs were released on Sunday morning. I wonder who published them. Now, were released is our passive. Here we don't know who has made the action, who has made the photos. So then we use the passive voice. Second, the agent is known, but there's no need of clarifying it. This is the same thing as what we said in the previous example. If we are in a familiar context and we already know who has done it, there's no need of saying who has done it because we already know who has produced the action. In this case, we would say, I was told to improve my oral skills. Now, I was told to improve my oral skills. We know that the teacher has already given us that advice, so we don't need to include by the teacher. We don't need to clarify because we already understand that is within a more academic context. The door is not relevant at all. So when really it's a bit of nonsense including the door because it's already understood. For example, the cocktail was elaborated with a perfect combination of alcohols. Who made cocktails? Usually the bartender. So why do we need to include the bartender if we already know there is already a given context? So it's not relevant. What we need is the action itself. And finally, when the general public is a doer, in this case, the administration, the government, all documents can be collected at school secretary's office. So can be collected is our passive, and it really we don't need anything we don't need to say by the administration or by the government or by whatever, because we already know where to hand these documents. So what is the structure that follows a passive? First, the structure is the verb to be plus the past participle. The verb to be has to be conjugated in the same tense as the active voice. So first of all, the first step is to look at the active voice and identify the tense in which is written the verb. If the verb is written in the present simple, then the verb to be would have to be written in the present simple. If the verb is written in the past perfect, then the verb to be in the passive voice have to be like had been plus the plus the past participle. For example, Real Madrid Stadium was built by Bernabeu. Really, we can have this sentence in the active voice. Santiago Bernabeu built, active sentence, the stadium, or the Real Madrid Stadium. That is, where are we placing the focus and the active on Santiago Bernabeu, the president of the Real Madrid team. Whereas on the passive voice, we are placing we're placing the focus on the Real Madrid Stadium. Now, as you see, we have this. The clause must start with an object direct and followed by this conjugation of the active or the passive voice. Now, for example, then also in the structure of a passive voice, as we said before, the subject is not always compulsory and doesn't need to be added at the end of the sentence. And this is something that students sometimes don't understand, that there are certain assumptions that do not need do not need to be included in the sentence, because we already know by context, my flight is cancelled. What are the problems with the passive voice? Well, some of the problems is that the intransitive verbs. Intransitive verbs cannot be converted into passive because they lack of the object direct. And so without an object direct, we cannot build up a passive voice. For example, we arrived home last night. Now, arrive it does not include a direct object, and so we cannot include, or we cannot transform it into a passive voice. We cannot say late is arrive or where arrive home. It hasn't got a sense, or hasn't got a meaning. Now, how do we get so the passive voices are usually done with the verb to be. We conjugate the verb to be in the same tense as we have done in the same tense as the active voice, and so we use this common way of expressing the passive voice. But we also have a passive with get. For example, this get the get is used for very informal context. For example, his hair was cut. He get his hair cut. And in the sense when we use this, he got his hair cut. Just a minute, please. So when we have this get in the passive voice, it means that it has a sense of obtaining something, of having obtained something. For example, Thomas got his hair cut in the barber shop. In this case, what we're implying is that Thomas was not a doer; it was something that he got and he got done. So the verbs that do not allow this get passive sentence are verbs of action or verbs of change. For example, she was kicked on her leg. He got kicked in her leg. Is because he obtained or he received an action. In that sense, we can use the get passive, but with actions with implies a change or an action, not. For example, Cristiano Ronaldo was loved by thousands of fans. we cannot say got loved by thousands of fans. Although it sounds good, it isn't. It hasn't got a meaning, or it hasn't got a sense, because you cannot get loved. You are, whether you're loved or you're not loved, but you don't obtain the love of someone. Other forms of passive, well, first of all, we have the, instead of the direct object, we can use the indirect object. For example, Toby offered Jim a Real Madrid t-shirt on his birthday. He was offered a Real Madrid t-shirt. In this case, we're not using the direct object, we're using the indirect object. We're using Jim as an indirect object. Also, we can use the passive voice with the phrasal verbs. For example, the meeting was called off. In fact, the second one, the passive voice of the meeting was called off, is the most used, and is used instead of the active voice of they call off the meeting. Using these sort of sentences is very widely used in the business context. We can also use the passive with the two infinitive expressions where you're supposed to, or you're expected to, or you're told to. Now, in these sentences, this is the you is used as an indirect object, and so we can use, or we can build up this passive with an indirect object. And in fact, these verbs allow us to include indirect objects. And finally, there are verbs that are already forming the passive. For example, was born, or is shaped, or is populated. Change from passive to active voice. First of all, we need to think, or to bear in mind, the structure, subject, verb, object, manner, place, and time. Now, that is the current structure of an active sentence. So we need to, when we take the passive voice, we need to identify first who is the complement, the direct object, and where is the verb. Also, we need to identify the tense in which the verb has been written, so that and where is the main verb. Once we have located the main verb and understand and observe what is the tense, we should place first the subject, then the verb, the main verb, in the tense of the in the tense in which the verb to be in the passive voice has been conjugated, and then just the direct object and the rest of the sentence. Now, assign the passive voice subject in the position of the object direct of the active voice. That's my car was destroyed by a hooligan during yesterday's match. Here, what we need to do first is understand which is the tense of the verb, which is the past simple, was, and then what is the main verb, destroy. So we should put destroyed as the main verb in the past simple. Now, who is the verb? Who's the doer? The English hooligan. So English hooligan destroyed what? My car, which is the direct object on which it forms the action, and then the rest of the sentence, which implies the manner, the place, and the time. We've got the manner, no. We have place, no, and we've got time, yes, yesterday much. Active verbs with a passive sense, for example, sell has this kind of a general property of an entity. For example, Scala Street sold quickly. Christmas. Smell also seems to be very passive in a way, with this passive idea. This perfume smelled wonderfully. Also, the sensations or the feelings already have this passive idea. Your hands feel hot. The ones who your hands makes the meat feel hot. And taste also. Hot dog is tasty. Or taste good. Hot dogs taste good. This hot dog tastes good. That is an error. Tastes. Okay, and to end up with today's thing, would have to that we have covered one of the most complex aspects of the English grammar. Above all, one of the most difficult concepts that the students have when dealing with the passive voice is not the current change of active to passive, but getting the get to passive correct. Most of the times, students have a lot of problems and understand that get how to make it get passive. And so this thing needs to be studied with patience and drill and make the students really intensively to get it right. And this allows, or we end with today's theme and today's class. Any questions, guys? Vale. Vale. Bueno, pues de cara al próximo sábado, que es cuando vais a hacer el examen, ¿vale? Os voy a abrir hoy, sí, probablemente hoy, os abriré pues lo mismo que hicimos en Navidad, ¿de acuerdo? Recuerdo lo mismo que hicimos en Navidad, que era hacer un examen, lo subís en PDF al aula Moodle y yo ya pues lo iré progresivamente corrigiendo. Si puedo corregirlo en vacaciones bien, si no, pues darme tiempo para que lo pueda ir corrigiendo, ¿vale? O sea que no os preocupéis, pero lo corrijo. Tardaré algo, pero lo corrijo. Sí, 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 sí.
Se nos escaquea Paula, ¿eh?
Sí, sí. Abro hoy el chisme este ¿cómo se llama? Lo del examen. La opción del examen.
La opción de entrega.
La opción de entrega. La abro hoy y la cierro el 26, la cierro el 27 lunes. Entonces, desde hoy hasta el 27 lunes podéis ir entregando todo lo que queráis. A partir del 27 se cierra y ya está, ¿vale? Bien, bien, Paula. Sí, importante. Bueno, pues nada, chicos. Si no hay más dudas.
Pues nada, os quedáis conmigo.
Sí.
¿Los has dejado suaves, Nacho?
Pues la verdad es que hoy encima planchados, porque han visto dos temas que son.
El otro día se me durmió Luis.
Seguramente.
En fin. Bueno, pues nada, chicos, chapamos chiringuito
Venga.
y lo volvemos a abrir, ¿vale? Se
Vale.
cierra la grabación de Nacho. Y Nacho, muchas gracias, ya hablamos, ¿vale? Luego,
Vale,
que
chao.
ya estás en la otra, ¿vale?
Vale,
De
vale.
todas formas, a las 4 nos vemos.
Venga, guay. Chao.
Venga, figura. Gracias.